largely, a lot of what we do is answer calls from people who are having problems with pesticides or have a lot of questions. And then we also work with groups throughout the country and try to organize around pesticide issues and work for reduction. I have just been with NCAMP, as we call it, for the last 9 months. Before that,
you can move even a little closer. You really have such a wide voice.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Are you sure you're an environmentalist? You're so quiet.
I think this is
I've
the
never
right
known
one.
one.
That flat knob, I
All right.
Oh, okay.
thank you. Hey, thank you.
No problem. It's my job.
Anyway, hopefully you can hear me better.
Much better.
I was with Food and Water before I came to NCAMP, so this is my first pesticide talk, so I'm hoping you all will bear with me a little bit because I'm used to talking about food irradiation. And I wanted to get some sense from you all if you know much about pesticides or not. Have any of you worked on, I know a few of you I recognize have worked on the issue, but a lot of you are pretty new to the issue. Good, that's what I was hoping. That was what I planned for. What I basically want to do is give you all kind of a brief introduction to the issue and then talk a little about my ideas of why we're in the mess we're in with pesticide use and try to get some feedback from you all and see if you all have ideas also. I wanted to start today with talking a little bit about Rachel Carson because this year is the 30th anniversary of the publication of Silent Spring, which more than anything else has really altered people's ideas about pesticides. It is a remarkable book. If you all haven't read it, I would really urge you to do it. I think the book really was instrumental in starting the whole environmental movement. And it's both scientific and very poetic. I mean, her use of language is absolutely beautiful. When she published Silent Spring in 1962, as you could expect, the industry came down on her very hard. They spent literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to discredit her. And wonderfully, that strategy backfired because what ended up happening was the book got a lot more publicity than it ever would have done with the minimal budget that they had. And it really brought the pesticide issue into public consciousness. It also affected public policy very quickly. President Kennedy started an advisory committee on pesticides, I think largely due to Rachel Carson's influence. And about 10 years later, in 1972, DDT, which was one of the major villains in Rachel Carson's book, was banned in this country altogether. It was also a real popular success, and to this day is a real big-selling book. And so it's been enormously influential, and just to me is just a remarkable thing. I wish I could be more like Rachel Carson and write like her. So what I'm going to do right now is just quickly give you kind of the fast overview of the whole pesticide issue, starting with the beginning. And I wanted to start with a few reference points. The pesticide industry is really only about 50 years old. In 1940, about 200,000 pounds of pesticides were used annually in this country. When Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962, there were about 700,000 pounds used annually. In 1985, pesticide use peaked at 2.7 billion pounds. And now the latest figures are it's gone down a little bit to about 2.2 billion pounds, which is still kind of a staggering amount of pesticides used in this country alone. In 1970, another point of reference, worldwide pesticide sales were about $3 billion. Today, it's about $22 billion. So you can see, despite what Rachel Carson did in Silent Spring and what all of us working on the pesticide issue are trying to do in terms of education, there's still been just a phenomenal growth in the pesticide industry. One of the things that people, I think, often don't realize is that despite this really heavy use of pesticides, there hasn't been concomitant reduction in pests, and the crop yields have actually decreased. In 1945, the crop losses were 31%. Today, it's 37%. And I'll talk about some of the reasons for that a little bit later. Another thing I think a lot of people don't know is that the pesticide industry really grew out of the labs in Nazi Germany. A German researcher in 1936 was the first person to discover organophosphates, which probably a lot of you have heard of. A couple of examples are parathion and malathion. That scientist even then felt that these chemicals should never be used because even minute, tiny amounts made test animals extremely sick. They had violent illnesses, convulsions, and death. So he recommended that they not be used. But of course, during the war, the Nazi war machine kind of resurrected the whole pesticide issue and did a lot of research and developed chemical warfare agents, which even the German government, even Nazis, would not use. Ultimately, they were banned for use in warfare, but guess what? We got the product. It's now used, obviously, in our food. It's used in our homes, in our schools, in our parks, everywhere. And I feel that's kind of typical about how society prioritizes things. It's the dollar, not health, and not the environment that we're really worried about. Initially, these chemicals were very poorly regulated, and those of us working on the pesticide issue feel like they're still real poorly regulated. But after Silent Spring, there was an attempt to kind of tighten up the regulations, look much more strictly at what could be registered. EPA was given the mandate to register pesticides, and by Congress they were told to go back and re-register all the pesticides that had gotten through under lax regulations. I don't have the exact dates for this because our staff scientist was gone when I was writing this. I think it was about 1972, and they were given several years to do this re-registration process. It's now 20 years later. The re-registration process has been extended and extended and extended and extended. Today, out of the 620 active ingredients that had been registered before this date, which I think was about 1972, only 19 of the active ingredients have gone through this re-registration process.
Question, what does this mean, this re-registration process?
It means that they go back through all the data that was submitted initially and look for what they call data gaps and get new information to try to fill those gaps, say on incidences of cancer or birth defects, things like that. And in a lot of the registrations, there are enormous data gaps, areas that we don't know anything about. So the mandate is to go and get that data collected and decide then if these pesticides should really be used or not. And I also want to say that once this, even the re-registration process has taken place, it doesn't mean that the pesticides are safe, because the calculations that are used, they use what's called a risk-benefit ratio. The risk-benefit calculations have to do with what are the problems, the incidences of cancer, say, and how are those offset against what they call the benefits in maybe expanded crop yields, for example. Our feeling is that you can't offset cancer deaths by increased crop yields. And even the statistics they use are hopelessly, hopelessly flawed. The material is not good at all, and so the calculations, I think, are just not valid in any way. And as I mentioned before, the crop use losses have actually increased. Anyway, pesticides are made up of a couple of things. They're active ingredients and what are known as inerts. The active ingredients are the target poisons that are supposed to kill the specific pests. Those have to be listed on the pesticide label. The inert ingredients, though, don't have to be listed on the label, and oftentimes they make up to 80 to 90% of the pesticide. They also are often known to be extremely hazardous, but people who are using them don't have any idea what's in there. You'd think from the name inert that it'd be something real innocuous like water, but that's not the case at all. There are over 1,400 chemicals that are considered inert ingredients. They're not subjected to extensive testing for health or environmental impacts, and 40 of the inerts are described by EPA as inerts of toxicological concern, which means they're probable carcinogens, nervous system toxins, they're capable of causing chronic effects, reproductive effects, or they're acutely toxic. To me, this next part is really unbelievable because some ingredients that are classified as active ingredients are also classified as inerts. They can be acutely toxic, and they have to be listed in certain pesticide formulations, but in others, they're not listed at all. An example is methyl bromide, which EPA permits only certified applicators to use and when it's an active ingredient, but when it's an inert ingredient in the pesticide formulation, it doesn't have to be listed at all. Okay, so we've got now somewhere between 2.2 and 2.7 billion pounds of pesticides being broadcast into our environment annually. What happens with these things? Where do they go? They wind up contaminating our groundwater, our surface water, rainwater is contaminated, people are poisoned, wildlife is poisoned, beneficial insects are killed. The stuff just doesn't disappear from the environment. It doesn't just react with a specific pest target, it reacts to all of us. Pesticides have been found contaminating water in 42 states. Right here in Baton Rouge, we're doing some work on a pesticide called atrazine, and I noticed we had an article that there's been atrazine found in Mississippi water right here. There are other areas where it's also found in the surface water, and oftentimes this is the water that's used for drinking water, for tap water in the cities. Atrazine can't be removed from water by the typical water treatment plants. So atrazine is getting into the drinking water. Now also EPA hasn't yet set a maximum allowable limit for atrazine. They're about to do that. The restrictions are going to go into effect this summer at 3 parts per billion, but up till now it's just been a health advisory. So oftentimes the levels of atrazine in drinking water in certain areas of the country will have been exceeding this 3 parts per billion. And nothing's been done about it, especially in the spring when there's real heavy atrazine use. And I should also mention, yeah.
Excuse me, have they found this in Louisiana? Are you saying that they found atrazine?
I found atrazine in Louisiana.
Because isn't that one of the things that Ciba-Geigy, is that specifically where they found it, or is there something?
In the Mississippi they found it. I'm not sure, because I'm not that familiar with Louisiana where else. So some of the other people here could probably fill you in. I should mention too that atrazine is in terms of poundage, it's the most heavily used pesticide in this country. But over 90 million pounds are used every year. Yeah.
Also,
Sorry.
according to BAC and CAMP issues, it's the pesticide first found when you're looking for anything else.
Yeah. Did you want to? Okay.
Would you spell that for us?
Atrazine.
I think that was a study done on the whole Mississippi River system, wasn't it? And this was just one of their
Just one,
stations
just one.
at Baton Rouge.
Right. We're doing a lot of work in Kansas, and they're trying to reduce atrazine use there, and Kansas City, Wichita, all draw their water from surface waters that are contaminated with atrazine. Oftentimes, it'll exceed 12 parts per million at certain times of the year in the drinking water. What's going to happen after the EPA maximum allowable limit is established is that in those communities, either there'll have to be a flyer sent out to everybody in the community saying, don't drink the water, use bottled water, or they're going to have to spend millions of dollars to add new filtration systems to the water treatment plants, which, as you know, in the economic climate that we've got right now, is going to be a real difficult thing to do.
Who is looking at this? Is this your organization that is looking at this? Is this some kind of enforcement agency or regulatory agency that's looking at this atrazine?
The atrazine levels are being established by the Environmental Protection Agency. Atrazine is also one of the pesticides that NCAMP is particularly targeting. So,
You mean the study?
Well, she's talking about them
It was
finding it and.
well, I was just going to mention that another thing that has been done is there's been a study by the United States Geological Survey on rainwater, and they've studied rainwater in 23 states and have found the rainwater contaminated with herbicides, atrazine being one of them, and sometimes again at levels higher than the maximal allowable. So it's falling, it's evaporating from the fields, getting caught up, and then falling back down on us as rain all over. And they only tested in 23 states. We can expect they'd probably find it in just about every state in the country. EPA, which I think has been notoriously poor in their groundwater protection strategies, even they now are saying that we must focus on prevention, that remediation is not working. They're spending millions of dollars, and sometimes they spend this money, and not only are things not improved, they're made even worse, and they can't even understand why that's happening. So the new EPA groundwater strategy is stressing prevention completely, but the regulations are still very poor. We've already talked about the fact that pesticides are indiscriminate poisons. They don't impact just the target pest. And as all of us are exposed to these mammoth amounts of pesticides used annually, it's also getting into our bodies. All of us probably in this room, all of us in the country probably have traces of pesticides because it's in our water, it's in our food, it's in hotels, it's in the lawns. And I wanted to just bring up one of the people in our office who's chemically sensitive. She was exposed to pesticides when she was an infant, and as a consequence is chemically sensitive, gets very ill when she's exposed to even small amounts, and has had learning disabilities also all her life, although she's extremely intelligent, wonderful, has been working on this issue for a long time. And she's an intern right now, and she was just telling us a story last week. We were having a staff meeting that a number of years ago, her doctors did a blood check on her to find out what pesticides they could find. And there are certain pesticides they're expecting to find, and those they did, but at levels that were literally just going off the chart. It was shocking. But what they also found were a very long list of other chemicals, other pesticides that they hadn't expected, and she was like showing us the computer printout was about this long. And it's just horrible, and all of us have that, and the people who are chemically sensitive, I think, are acting as our canaries. Cassie in our office says that she thinks all of us are being impacted, all of us are suffering adverse effects from pesticides, but some of us are just not recognizing it. We can function a little better.
What happened to her that she was exposed?
They used chlordane in her house very heavily when she was real small, and had told her parents that that it was perfectly safe and that they didn't have to worry about the baby, and so she's just suffered. And her story is horrible. I mean, her house was so heavily contaminated, they had to move out of it. Her father is dying now of cancer. Her mother is dying of cancer. Her whole family is wiped out, and she's basically had to live with this all her life, and they're sure it's due to the pesticides. And she's expecting that she's have a shortened life also. So it's really nice to have somebody like that working with you, because it makes, you know, sometimes when you're working in the office all day, it becomes more academic and scientific, and to have somebody right there who's experienced a lot of the horrible repercussions of pesticide use is so helpful.
Excuse me, but to better understand that, now why would they have used chlorine throughout the house?
Uh,
Was the major termite treatment.
Yeah, it's
Years.
a structural pest
It's been
control.
replaced in the last 5 years.
It's been removed from the market partly due to the work of NCAMP. We filed a legal suit against the EPA. It was voluntarily withdrawn. It's still, EPA hasn't banned it outright. It should be. And we know that chloridane is being used around the country. Old, remaining chloridane is being used in some chemical formulations. So
What about the ordinary, like, man who comes in and sprays for roaches and ants and et cetera?
It uses an organophosphate, chlorpyrifos is the name of it.
that and
Is it
among
more
other
safe?
things. Yeah.
Is it safer?
What is the life
Chronic.
of chloridane?
Chloridane lasts in the house for a very long time. Unfortunately, I'm not a scientist, so I can't tell you
More-
It was
exactly.
12 years.
It's longer than that, it's more than 20
Is
years.
it more?
The Air Force, for a long time, they treated military housing en masse. And the Air Force went back and did studies 20 years later and found concentrations approximately 50% of the original concentrations after 20 years. And their company, Velsicol, is the only manufacturer, was the only manufacturer. They did studies with a perfect application, exactly according to directions. And they found that there was, even with that, subtrenching and all that, there was still airborne concentrations, contamination of houses. And even with the company-sponsored remediation programs, they
They
were
can't-
ineffective.
they
So
can't get rid of
essentially, if a house has been treated, it is contaminated.
It's
and can't be
contaminated,
cleaned out.
and it shouldn't, other people shouldn't live in it. It persists for a very long time, and it gets into everything.
Velsicol was one of the companies that was tested by IBT Corporation, which did fraudulent testing of a whole number of pesticides in the mid-70s. And that was part of the reason for the retesting, recertification process. But there's a whole bunch of pesticides that are on the market, that are being used, that are classified as safe, that were part of the pesticides that were tested
That's
by
right,
IBT.
that's right, and other labs also doing fraudulent data.
Are you gonna mention anything about the hazardous waste being recycled under the auspice of inert ingredients and pesticides?
I'm not gonna talk about it because I don't really, we've been trying to find out more information, but it's really, really hard to come by, and it's virtually impossible. We've been talking to a variety of people about it, but we haven't been able to come up with anything concrete. I wanna just,
Just a
Sure.
question. What type of cancer is related to chloridane?
I can't tell you. I'm sorry.
In animals, it's primarily liver cancer. There's been a suggestion of some leukemias and lymphomas.
Thank you. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, knows that the cancer rate has gone up phenomenally. When I was working with Food and Water, the founder is a physician, and he said that he's been practicing about 40 years. When he was first practicing, if there was a cancer patient in the hospital, all the doctors would come and study it because it was so unusual. And he uses about 1 in 20 cancer rate in 1950. I'm not sure exactly how accurate that is because I've been trying to get that information from a variety of sources, and nobody's been able to really come up with anything concrete. But right now, as probably many of you know, the cancer rate that's being given most often by professionals is 1 in 3. I've just learned last week that it really is now approaching 1 in 2. It's just, yes.
I I would like to inform this audience that in Lake Charles, the Department of Health and Human Resources made a report to our estuary task force stating Dr. Chen showed on the concrete wall all these computer data, and she said that Lake Charles has no cancer to be concerned about, that really less than the rest of the United States. The only cancer of any significance is among minority women, which is cervical cancer, and it's their fault because they do not get or go in for pap smears. So it's their fault because of the late detection that they're done.
Right, it's just not a problem.
I'd
The
like to-
Cancer Society is,
I saw
Now, this
that
is
report.
the Louisiana Department of Health and Human Health.
Yes, I saw that report and I couldn't believe it. What
Well, I'm
all the
glad you
study
couldn't
did,
believe it.
all the study did was compare the incidence rate of cancer in Louisiana, in South Louisiana, with the national.
yeah, it's,
The tumor
And
registry
then
is a joke.
What got me upset is in the executive
unless
summary,
it's-
somebody wrote, some believe that air, water, and land pollution contributes or causes cancer, is a major cause of cancer. This monograph and many other cancer studies in South Louisiana do not support this belief. They didn't even study that.
yeah.
You
Well,
know,
it's a real scandal.
they
The
did
whole,
not study that. They didn't even ask that question.
you know,
So
the
it's
American
so
Cancer
misleading.
Society, I mean, we're supposedly winning the war on cancer. And statistically, that's just not borne out at all. In fact, Wally Bernstein, Food and Water, is taking on a new project, the cancer project, with Dr. Sam Epstein. And really, they've done an incredible job of exposing what's really happening, because the whole cancer industry, I mean, it's an industry. And they're working on not prevention, but some of the symptoms and extending people's lives for a few years and calling this a cure, which obviously it isn't. And so what Food and Water and Sam and a lot of other people are trying to do is say, listen, we got to prevent this from happening. You know, we don't want to just go in there and carve people up and use radiation and chemotherapy. A couple of other just quick statistics is that there's a 1986 study by the National Cancer Institute reporting that farmers using 2,4-D for 20 or more days a year, and you know farmers use it more often than that, are 6 times more likely to develop non-Hodgkin's lymphoma than non-farmers, and the risk is a lot higher for those that mix and apply the pesticides themselves. There's been another study on female workers who've been exposed to atrazine that indicates they're 3 times more likely to develop ovarian cancer. Another, I think, extremely disturbing, and people need to know about this, is that children are much, much more susceptible to the toxic effects of pesticide use. It builds up more in their bodies. They're not able to eliminate it as well. They receive higher doses. They're usually exposed more through playing outside in lawns. And also, there have been studies finding that in infant breathing zones that tend to be lower to the floor where toddlers are, the ventilation is less and the concentration of the pesticides is much, much higher. So children are very much at risk. We've always felt that a good way in terms of organizing people on the pesticide issue and educating them is through working with schools and trying to eliminate pesticide use in the schools, because parents who wouldn't worry about pesticides for themselves, when you start pointing out what it's doing to their children, really start getting very, very upset. And then they get into the whole issue, and you can bring in all the other aspects of it as well. I wanted to run in, for those of you who don't know, a few of the other kinds of things that pesticides cause. Acute symptoms of pesticide poisoning include dizziness, nausea, headaches, rashes, and mental disorientation. Mental disorientation a lot of times is perceived as people being crazy, but it's actually caused by the pesticides. In addition, there are chronic health effects, in addition to cancer, like birth defects, genetic damage, neurological, psychological, and behavioral effects, blood disorders, reproductive effects, abnormalities in liver, kidney, and immune system function. And then there's the chronic poisoning that I've been talking about, which has been increasing at just an alarming, staggering rate. According to the World Health Organization, which is an extremely conservative organization, they say that there are 25 million cases of pesticide poisoning worldwide every year. To me, that's a pretty huge number, but it doesn't even begin to approach the number of actual cases, because the monitoring of pesticide poisoning is very mediocre. Most physicians and public health officials don't recognize symptoms of pesticide poisoning. They say that it's the flu or just misdiagnosed altogether. So when you talk about 25 million, you have to recognize that that's just the tip of the iceberg. And then, as if all of this isn't bad enough, there's some extremely alarming studies coming out of groups working in the Great Lakes on wildlife. And at our recent conference in Washington, we were real fortunate to have one of the researchers speak. If any of you are members or could consider being members of NCAMP, in our next issue of our newsletter, we're going to have a kind of abbreviated form of her talk, which is so alarming, I can't tell you. But anyway, what they're finding when they're studying the wildlife in the Great Lakes is that they've been misjudging the effects, because they've been looking for things that are very overt and obvious, like we've been studying cancer in the human population. And oftentimes the adult or the wildlife that's been exposed directly to the pesticides don't show any overt symptoms of pesticide poisoning. So they've stopped there. What these new studies are doing is going on and studying the offspring, and they're finding really disturbing results with feminization, wasting of the offspring, tremendous amount of immune deficiencies. They're finding things like twisted beaks and animals born without wings or webbed feet and things like this. It's really horrible. So what they're now concluding is that the pesticides that they're being exposed to are being passed on through the reproductive system to the offspring. And the ramifications, of course, to the human population and what this means are really, really chilling.
And about that, those symptoms of pesticide poisoning, one of the things that that's against us really is the fact that the doctors have not studied this enough.
That's
they just say, and that's one of the things that I've been trying to do in my area.
Yeah.
Is give the symptoms to all of the doctors. We talk about it, give them the symptoms, and tell them, ask them to look for these symptoms.
It's a terrible problem throughout the country, and there are not enough people who are really working on this. There are not enough physicians who recognize it and who are out there. And a lot of times, chemically sensitive people or people who have suffered from pesticide poisoning are thought to be crazy, and that the doctors don't treat them as normal human beings. It's a horrible, horrible problem, and we're trying to work on that, but it's very, very slow going. There's no place to go to try to educate these physicians.
Well, we were just sitting here talking about that, and we were thinking if there was something printed up that maybe y'all could print up that looked official, like a little card that said these are the symptoms, and that looked official, that we could give to doctors.
If you've worked with the medical profession, it's a really tough thing, and they don't trust environmental
No,
groups.
it would have to be from the American
It
Medical
has to be from within, yeah. And Physicians for Social Responsibility are starting to work on this. I think they could be very helpful. Some other groups are really working on it. There's some doctors in the field who are very knowledgeable, who are speaking out and educating others. I'm just going to kind of keep running through this, and then I'll open up more in a little bit. As I've been reiterating, one of the truly horrible things about this heavy growth of the pesticide industry is it's not working. We keep increasing the use of pesticides, and yet our crop yields are going down. And what's happening is that insects and plants develop resistances to pesticides very, very quickly. So a pesticide that was used 1 year, a few years later, doesn't work at all. Or they have to apply doses that are much, much higher and much more frequent. And, you know, a perfect example is the glutathione, the azon-phosphomethyl that's been used so heavily in Louisiana and sugarcane, is that now they have to dump huge amounts to have any impact at all. And of course, last summer was the horrible fish kills in the state, which hopefully is going to start making some changes in understanding perception. And then also what happens is that frequently you'll wipe out one pest, and that pest has kind of kept the other pest populations down. So then you end up having secondary pest problems. The whitefly in California is an example that they've had terrible problems with, and in the past they had natural predators that kept the population down for that. Does industry worry about the resistance? Obvious answer is no. They could care less. In fact, and often they're delighted. There was a quote that I came across of an industry researcher, and he summed it up by saying that resistance is probably an overall benefit to industry because it opens up new markets for insecticides and increased sales. So, of course, that's the kind of mentality that we're combating. Anyway, that's the quick Pesticide 101 course that I wanted to run through. I also wanted to try to get into some of the underlying reasons before I really open things up for a wide-ranging discussion. Working on any of the issues when I was working on food irradiation and incineration and some other issues, I think they're all so connected. The sources are all the same. I've been talking about pesticides. I could just as easily have been talking about any number of the issues that you all are working on. And what I and probably everybody in this room and anybody involved in this movement have been trying to figure out is, why is this happening? Why has there been this phenomenal increase in pesticide use and toxics when we know that it's a problem? And I think there's sort of two parts to it. I mean, there's first the industry part, and that's the easy answer, and that's, you know, largely based, I think, on greed. That pesticides fill a niche, that people make a lot of money off of them. And as a farmer said in a video that I saw real recently, corporations are there to make dollars. They have no morals, and I think that's absolutely true. A food wholesaler told my former boss, Wally Bernstein, once that they would sell cyanide, food coated with cyanide to customers if there was a market for it, if consumers bought it. That's how little they care about the health effects on people. A second reason, I think, for the huge increase in use is ignorance. I mean, I think that there are truly people selling pesticides, researching pesticides, and using it, that don't realize how bad these things are. And I think that was particularly true in the early years when people thought pesticides were the answer to wiping out malaria, to increasing crop yields. I think there was a hopefulness that these were going to be very helpful. What that really indicates, of course, is how little we truly understand our natural ecosystem, and that we really can't start introducing things like this into the environment without having a real, complete, thorough grounding in how this planet works, which we obviously don't have, so we have no right to start throwing things out into the environment because they don't disappear. There's no place for this stuff to go. I think it also shows how anthropocentric we are. It's okay to kill other species as long as it makes life more comfortable for the all-important humans, which is a way of thinking that I find real hard to deal with. Hand in hand with ignorance, I think, goes this pervasive faith in technology, that technology is going to solve all of our problems. Despite the evidence to the contrary, I think people really believe this is true, and as faith in other areas, like faith in our families, in our communities, in deities has diminished, there's been an incremental increase in faith in technology till we're practically worshiping that instead. So the reasons why pesticides and other toxic materials are used in our society, I think, are fairly straightforward. A lot of you could add some other reasons as well. The thing that's much more difficult to figure out is, why do people tolerate it? I've been thinking about this for years, and I still haven't been able to come up with the great answer. But one of the things that I think is the case is that our society fosters politeness. We're not supposed to speak out loudly and harshly. And there's a quote by Rachel Carson that I particularly like, which I think indicates how we feel. Who would want to live in a world that is just not quite fatal? I mean, who would? But we all are. We're all putting up with it. We're being slowly poisoned, and we're being real quiet about it. I also think that people in their hearts know what's happening. They know that we're slowly poisoning ourselves. And yet there's this inertia. People don't know what to do about it. We're reading every day, we hear, we work, we see people dying, we hear about acid rain, the diseases, pesticides, holes in the ozone layer, global warming. And I think that one of the reasons there's so much depression and so much apathy is that we know that we're killing ourselves, and it seems like such an insurmountable task to take on to fix it, that people don't even know where to start. They don't know what to do. That's still a superficial answer, though. What's underlying this? What's underlying our politeness? Why aren't we out there demanding change? I recently read a book that I think really puts it, to me it said more than anything else that I've read about it. It's a book by Ann Wilson Schaaf on the addictive society, and basically her premise is that we live in an addictive society and we're all part of the problem. What we're really suffering from is victimization, and we're all acting like victims. I think of studies done on battered women, and I think that a lot that's what we're doing to ourselves, is we're not getting ourselves out of this abusive cycle that we're in. And I think that we look to people in power, authority, people with money, and think that they're going to fix things for us, and think that they have all the power, as opposed to recognizing that we're giving over our power to other people, that we actually have it. Obviously, these companies can't survive without our buying their products. There are more of us than there are of them. And yet still, this suicidal cycle is being perpetuated. So anyway, I think that she really hit on the underlying problem. And essentially, I think what has happened is that we've come to accept abuse. It's the norm for us. We don't see anything better. It's like, abused women saying, well, the only other answer is I'll be out on the street, so it's better at least to stay here and get beaten up and have a roof over my head and sometimes have some food. The only way out of abuse is to recognize it, to call it by name, to start working against it, to do intervention. This kind of, the toxics that are being unloaded on our society is a violation of the most basic human rights that we have. And yet we're tolerating it. We have to break out of it. We have to help other people recognize what's happening. We have to get angry. Anger is a good thing. It's positive. And I think our society has basically kind of tried to eliminate that feeling from people. We're taught that it's bad. But there are different ways of being angry. There's an anger that can be focused and creative and very, very productive. And I think that we need I mean, I have a tendency to be very polite too. And it's real hard to break out of that cycle and start calling things for what they are and start standing out and being aggressive and strident and saying, no, this is intolerable, this can't continue to happen. And so what I'm here to encourage, and what I encourage people when I'm in the office who call me, is to say, get angry, start thinking about what these problems are, and start talking to other people, break through their denial, because denial is a real, real powerful blinder to all of us. So we got to break that down, and that's a real difficult process, because once you start it, it's very depressing initially, and you go through this cycle of depression and anger and feeling impotent, and then though, once you've internalized this understanding of what's really happening, you can start to really make positive change, and the joy starts coming back too, because you feel like you're doing something that's useful and having an impact. You start discovering your own power. That, you know, I think the name of the game, and a lot of you I know who are working here are really trying to, you can't empower somebody else, but you can help foster an atmosphere of self-empowerment. And once you start taking your own power back, you're a pretty potent force. So that is my ultimate message, and any of you who want to add.
Well, I would like a question answered, and that is, when people tell you, you really should know that all these pesticides break down and become harmless after a certain period of time, and you don't know how to answer these people. I mean, that is a real problem. And in the city of New Orleans, our health department is concerned with AIDS. They are not concerned with anything else.
There are so many problems, and there's not enough money. But we have to just be a lot more vocal. I should say that anybody who needs information on pesticides should feel free to call NCAMP. Our number is 202-543-5450. We have, 202-543-5450.
Where's your address? I used to
It's
subscribe.
701 E Street, Southeast, Suite 200, Washington, D.C., 20003. Just one second. NCAMP has an incredible resource library. We have enormous materials on pesticides. It is very difficult to work on this issue without having the scientific material. We have a full-time staff ecologist. We also usually have a full-time staff toxicologist. We're out of one right now, but we're in the hiring process. And so you can call us and you can really get the hard facts. And we also have a lot of written material. We have chemical watches, we call them, that are just one-pagers on the chemicals and what they do, and they're very, very helpful.
Do you do herbicides as well?
We do everything. We do everything. Helen?
Yes, I just wanted to say that a lot of my own education about pesticides has come from getting your publication. I don't know, it's about...
Pesticides and you?
Yes, and it's at BIMA every 2 months?
It comes out 5 times a year.
It's very excellent, and I would recommend it highly, and I think we all need a lot more information on pesticides, as we do all toxics. But pesticides has been sort of like the hidden, you might say, the sleeping giant, the tip of the iceberg. And it's just part of what goes into everything that has made Louisiana what it unfortunately is, a place that needs to really be cleaned up. But NCAMP's publication is excellent, and I get a lot of my information that way every 2 months. So I would recommend that it would be a way to get a handle on it.
You can join NCAMP, become a member for $25 a year, and then you get the pesticides in you. I'd encourage all of you to join and become members. We could really use it.
Do you have some,
I,
blank?
I don't believe
You can fill out.
it's terrible. I know. I have to go to executive committee meeting after I leave here, and I had so much to do before I left that was just kind of crazy. Okay. Yeah.
You said there was a book by a lady, Ann Wilson.
Shape.
What was that name of the book?
It's, I can't remember the exact name. It's the Addictive Society. I actually brought it with me, so if you want to come find me later, I'll.
One thing that you didn't touch on that I think is very, very important is that not only do we have to educate ourselves and our neighbors, et cetera, but as long as our politicians, whether it happens to be our governor, which we have right now, or Bob Odom, who's over agriculture, as long as we sit back and continue allowing these kind of people in office, you know, we will just continue in this vicious cycle of just literally destroying our earth. People need to realize how important that is.
Agriculture runs this state.
Yeah, I know, in many states.
Other than Czar.
In many states. Yes, no.
Is there any work going on with like farmers and trying to, I mean, I'm sure a large part of the pesticide use is farmers, and not all of it, but I mean, to get they're not exactly, as I understand it, I don't know that much about the economy here, but they're kind of squeezed. To get them to be able to switch over to more sustainable. Is any of that going on in Louisiana?
You
I don't know, but I can tell you they're feeling the pressure. I know a beef farmer that farms about between 1,000 and 2,000 acres, depending. And he used to use airplanes to spray. And he's feeling the pressure now, and he no longer uses airplanes. They go in the field with a tractor and spray, and so he's narrowing it down. It's getting further and further down. And I've been telling Donnie, get ready, because sooner or later, you're going to have to figure out a way to do it without your pesticides. They're coming at you. And they're feeling the pressure.
They're scared too bad. They really are. We've got a
I think that
lot of
they-
They think that we're taking everything away from them and they're gonna lose all of their crops.
But they can actually probably do pretty well if they just would have some help switching to something that's less
I think that's
emphasized
the
on
key.
pesticides. As
Yeah.
you're saying, their yields haven't really increased even with all this stuff.
They really need to transition, and it can't be overnight. But I think a lot of farmers, after last summer, especially in the southern part of the state, feel very vulnerable and are willing to listen, not a lot, but some are willing to listen, and some are quietly cutting back a little bit. But there are some farmers in our areas that would really like to stop using pesticides.
Some
So
cases
there
they
is
can't get
interest
along.
in sustainable agriculture, where they could cut back on the pesticides and get their profit and be environmentally sound. That's what it really needs to be.
See, and
They're
of-
starting to hear that.
And of course, what's happening is that the research money isn't going to sustainable. It's going to perpetuating the pesticide cycle. So our whole society is structured to make that transition real difficult. And in addition to that, one of the problems that really makes me angry is that environmental groups and sustainable agriculture groups and, you know, there's a lot of turf battle stuff going on. And so people aren't working with each other. You know, our organization largely is a resource, and we try to network people, but we're not working with the Family Farm Coalition real closely or something like that. And that's the kind of thing that has to happen in order for us to make systemic change.
There won't be systemic change under the current national farm policy. I mean, it isn't just a
It can't
question of
happen.
getting farmers to change their mind about something. Our whole farm policy is built on a system that favors pesticide use and increased short-term output.
Some people can't even get loans unless they're agreed to use
That's right.
pesticides.
Plus all the research is developing crops that are so sensitive that they have to have pesticide. I mean, like they might have 2 varieties of corn. They'll concentrate on a variety of corn that can't survive without heavy like herbicide use rather than a kind of, and
That's
these are
right.
the same companies that are funding
That's right.
So it's our research institutions in our state
Yes.
that
Yeah.
really have
I'd like
to
to-
make
And
a
the
change,
state
and that
university
comes, of
system.
course, through USDA, through Farm Bill.
There is,
So, yes.
there is a small step, I work for DEQ, and I'm a little bit, my job tasks aren't really the non-point source program, but I know the coordinator very well, and I probably will become involved. And, she has done a tremendous effort in the last 3 years to try to get the environmental organizations
environmental state agency, talking to the SCS, the Department of Agriculture, the Rice Research Center in Crowley. All their research is, what they're interested in is production. They want to produce more. That's what they research. And right now, the non-point source program has a lot of federal funds, a lot of money to do research to try to figure out how we can solve our water quality problems. The Mermentau River Basin has the most impaired water bodies in the state, and it is agricultural. You can barely get them to admit it, even though the land is used, over 90% of the land is used for agriculture. But they are now, because they're driven by money, they want that money. But what they have to realize is that we're not going to give them the money to research production. We're going to give them the money to try to solve our water quality problems. And so it is beginning. I went to a meeting and sat in a room with DEQ, the Assistant Commissioner of Agriculture was there, SCS representatives, and farmers, and the research staff at the center. So it's just beginning, you know, to have all those people talk together is a very big step.
I'm getting signals that we have to wrap it up. Is there one?
I really do need to ask this group a question, if I may. How do you address, I had a realtor, I'm the president of the environmental group Clean in Lake Charles. I had a realtor call me and tell me that he sells mostly rural property. He always had to wear boots when he showed his property. He said he never has to wear boots anymore. The ditches are dead. There are no snakes in the ditches. And at first I said, wonderful, because snakes. But then I said, you mean no frogs, no crickets, no worms? He said, that's what I mean. No fish. So I invited him to our meeting, our public meeting, with the police jury, because they're the ones who control the spraying of the ditches. And when your police jury has a perfect presentation of how much, they know exactly how much Roundup they're using, they can designate to that wall how much they're using, and the proportions are correct. But then we said, well, what about then Gulf States comes along and then they spray and it drips into the ditches. Then the mosquito control comes along and then they spray. But they're all saying it's necessary, and how much of that is getting into our groundwater? And how do you change their mind that they shouldn't put somebody on a tractor out? Well, then the reason he couldn't put anybody on a tractor is he said that it digs up the dirt too much and it destroys the dirt and it's too costly and blah, 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 blah.
It all comes back to education. I mean, it's a long process. There's no real quick answer that I can give you. I think we have to wrap up. You seem like you have.
All of us are responsible ourselves as consumers, since we're buying the produce, which is produced with pesticides. We have alternatives. We have organic produce, and if we support that industry, then the economics will improve.
Yeah.
As well.
Every now and then you see.
It really is a whole internalization of how you live. I mean, you have to think everything through. It's difficult right here. I think we have to break. I've been getting lots of signals that we're supposed to be moving on to the next.
One of the things that